If you're the kind of person who loves to fall down a research rabbit hole, or if you've ever learned something and thought, how does nobody know this? Then informative speaking might be the right event for you. So today, let's break down what info speaking actually is, how it works, and why it might be a great fit for you. So let's hop on over to exactly what informative speaking is. First, it's important to start with what it's not. A lot of speakers join informative speaking because they think they're going to be able to do a fact dump, a Wikipedia article, or a lecture. But that's not what it is. In fact, that's going to be quite boring to your audience. Instead, where info really begins is by peeling back the unseen layers of a topic. It's about starting with something that seems obvious or totally ignored, and then showing how it's connected to something much bigger than your audience expected. So you're not just informing, you're shifting how people think. And one of the coolest parts about info is that you get to use visual aids. Informative is the only speech event where visual aids are allowed. And when done well, they don't just decorate the speech, they actually deepen the message. And something we found is that the best topics end up doing well if the topic requires visuals. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But let's take just a step back and think about what makes a great info speech. A great info speech is one that really feels like a puzzle. One where each piece you present helps the audience see a more complete picture of something they've never fully considered. And so here are the types of things the best info speeches do. They introduce a surprising or overlooked concept, an idea that raises questions or curiosity. They explain it clearly and creatively, using research, examples, analogies, and yes, visuals to make the complex feel understandable. And they especially build towards a hidden argument, some sort of insight, implication, or shift in thinking that lingers long after the speech ends. And like I said, they use visual aids. Info is the only event where speakers use visual aids, which are typically large boards on a stand that incorporate images and designs to add a visual layer to your speech. And no, unfortunately, you cannot use PowerPoints or technology at this point, just because campuses where speakers present do not always have equitable technology access. So they have to be physical, but it adds a huge layer of engagement to your speech. It allows you to be much more creative in terms of the types of topics that you have and the way that you're able to present them. And like I already said, the best info speakers don't add visual elements as a cherry on top. They actually pick topics that require visual elements. Otherwise, they wouldn't make sense. For instance, the 2025 national champion on colorism in photography required visuals because that was a topic that could only be conveyed to an audience if they could see the actual photos that revealed the way that our biases around race are reflected in norms around photography editing. Or the runner-up in 2025, a speaker that gave a speech on sight or vision and eyes. That speech was one that utilized so many visual elements about the way that we see the world that it really wouldn't have worked if it had been any other speech event. And so the main goal of all of these info speeches is to ultimately make the audience rethink something fundamental about society, about power, about people, about themselves, about our perspective on the world. And that's the real goal of a high-level informative speech, not just to explain, but to reveal. To get us to think, wow, I thought this was just about X, but now I see how it actually connects to Y and Z too. So an info speech isn't just going to be a Wikipedia info. It's going to open a door into something the audience hasn't considered or hasn't seen from a certain perspective and help them to see how a topic is much more far-reaching in its effects and its relevance than we previously thought. You're unfolding an idea, you're curating clarity, you're building curiosity, and you're guiding discovery. So let's think about some of these actual topics. One example, a Bellarmine student, Gavin Griffin, who reached Info Finals and was ranked third place in 2023, his speech topic was on biraciality. But instead of simply describing what being biracial is, Gavin unpacked the psychological and cultural experience of being both and neither, especially connecting it to his own feeling of being, or his own experience of being biracial, being both white and Chinese. He revealed how biracial identity challenges our rigid racial narratives and exposes the failures of simplistic labels. So instead of just being descriptive about biraciality, he moved to a much deeper hidden argument about the failures of simplistic labels, of binary forms of thinking, of black and white. Some other examples that we have, like I said, the speech on colorism in photography did a really good job of showing us that photography has built-in biases against people of darker skin tones, which is a form of colorism that has serious social consequences. So notice something like photography or colorism doesn't seem that deep on the surface, but they build towards a much deeper argument that gets us to rethink certain assumptions about our world. Another example was a speaker, a finalist, who gave a speech on play. And we just think of play as something frivolous, something kids do, but she reframed play as having a primal biological need that's essential for human development, and that in the modern world, we have systematically removed it from childhood in ways that have severe consequences. So notice, what are the components of a successful info topic? And I'll talk more about these if you end up choosing info. But often they have a personal connection, some sort of authentic story, lived experience, or emotional stake that you yourself have that will connect you to your topic and make it feel more authentic for the audience. Great info topics often have visual potential, right? The topic's inherent capacity to be explained or dramatized through images, charts, or symbols that make the information clear and memorable. The best info topics, and almost all of them, have some sort of intellectual surprise. It reveals something unexpected or counterintuitive or newly reframed. You can't just pick topics that people already know about, or pick topics that are too fringe that your audience isn't going to care about for reasons I'll explain in just a moment. Oftentimes, there's a moral or structural stake, and that means that the topic digs deeper to expose some sort of harm or injustice or systematic failure, something that needs to change. So this is why, again, a lot of info speakers come in because they really want to talk about some nerdy scientific topic, or they want to talk about something that they like a lot, like video games. But if it doesn't have those moral stakes or that intellectual surprise, then you're really not going to grip your audience. And that leads me to the last component, which is about audience relevance. And this is the question of, will people even care? Even if they haven't heard of this before, can I help them see why it matters to them? Or maybe if it is something that affects their life every single day, do I have a way to have some sort of intellectual surprise that's going to grip them? So all of these are the components I typically see for successful informative speeches. Some lean more heavily into others, and I'll talk about these more in a later video. But let's also hop over here, which is what I call the archetypes of successful info speeches. And I've been tracking the national finalists for years, and I've realized that they oftentimes fit into one of these 5 categories of archetypes. The first one is the identity explainer, and you can see how this corresponds to personal connection over here. And this is the speech that explains, who are you, and what can your experience teach me about the world? There's the mythbuster archetype, which is answering the question, what do we think we know that is actually wrong? So this is really drawing on the element of you think X, but actually Y. There's a speech that addresses the forgotten or lost need. This is like the speech on play, where it answers the question, what essential human experience are we losing in modern society? There's the flashpoint reframer, or the current social, timely, relevant commentary, which is a less clean name, which is what's the real story behind this controversial cultural issue or political headline. And we've seen that type of topic work. It's a delicate one, because if you pick a controversial cultural issue or political headline that everybody knows about, you have to make sure that you have something unique to say to add to that conversation to get us thinking on a much deeper level about that topic. But if you pick a big topic, like let's say immigration in 2025 under Donald Trump's second administration, and you don't have a take that brings us much deeper about this topic than headlines would already go, then you're not going to be able to really get an audience to care. And finally, an archetype of speech that I would call deconstructing the everyday. And this is answering the question, what everyday object or experience reveals something deeper about how society works? And so this is getting us to something that we think is being mundane, but actually showing us that it's a lot deeper. So that was a very quick run through. These are the types of archetypes of speeches. These are the components that typically go into a successful info speech. And this is, I think, a pretty accessible diagram of what informative speaking is. And so if ultimately at the end of the day, you're curious, you're creative, and you love explaining things in a way that makes people say, whoa, I never thought about that, then info could be your event. It's the only one that lets you use visuals. It's the one that rewards clarity, insight, and conceptual depth. And if you choose the right topic, it can be just as impactful and thought-provoking as any argument made in the other speech events. If you end up choosing info, in subsequent videos, we're really going to dive deep into all of these components that make for a successful info topic, as well as these archetypes to begin breaking down the process of actually writing or selecting a topic and then writing an info speech. But hopefully this helped.